The 2-minute speech that won the crowd. The room was heavy with silence. Hundreds of eyes stared at the small stage, waiting for the next speaker to walk up. It was a public speaking contest, one of the biggest in the city. And among the confident voices, the loud laughter, and the polished suits, stood a trembling young man named Ethan. He had never spoken on a stage before. His hands were shaking, his throat dry, his mind screaming, "What am I doing here?" He wasn't the type you'd expect to see there. He wasn't charismatic or loud, he was quiet, almost invisible in a crowd. But deep inside him burned something fierce. A story, a truth, a message that he had carried for years. When his name was called, Ethan stood up slowly, feeling the weight of every heartbeat echoing in his chest. He walked to the microphone, and for a moment, everything stopped. You could hear the air conditioning hum, the faint cough from the back row, and the beating of a dream trying not to die. He looked out into the audience, hundreds of faces, some smiling politely, others distracted, scrolling on their phones. The fear in his chest whispered, "They don't care." And yet, another voice, quiet but firm, answered, "Speak anyway." He took a deep breath and said nothing. 1 second passed, 2, 5. The audience started shifting uncomfortably. A few people looked at each other. Was he frozen? Did he forget his lines? Then, he finally spoke. His voice was soft, almost fragile. 2 years ago, I almost ended my own life. The room froze. No one moved. No one coughed. Ethan's eyes were wet, but his voice began to steady as he continued. I wasn't seen, I wasn't heard, and I thought my voice didn't matter. But someone once told me, sometimes, the quietest people have the loudest hearts. And I think that's true. You could feel the shift. The energy in the room changed. This was no longer a speech, it was a confession. Raw. Honest. Real. He continued, his words coming faster now. Not rehearsed, not perfect, but true. I used to believe that confidence meant being loud, but now I know it means being real. It's not about speaking without fear, it's about speaking despite fear. Every sentence landed like a quiet explosion. You could see people straightening in their chairs, leaning in, listening, not to a contestant, but to a human being who dared to be authentic. He looked around the room and said, if you're listening right now and you've ever felt invisible, I see you. If you've ever felt like your voice doesn't matter, it does. Tears glimmered in more than a few eyes. Even the judges had stopped taking notes. Ethan smiled faintly and said, I only have 2 minutes, but maybe that's enough time to tell someone what I wish I had heard years ago. That your story is not over, that silence doesn't mean weakness, and that one honest word can save a life. Then he took a deep breath and stepped back from the mic. No big ending. No applause line. Just truth. And for a few long seconds, there was silence again. The same silence that had started the speech. But this time, it was different. This silence was alive. Then, as if on cue, someone stood up and started clapping. Then another. And another. Within moments, the room exploded in applause. Not polite clapping, but thunderous, heartfelt, unstoppable applause. Ethan stood there, stunned, as tears filled his eyes again. But this time, they weren't tears of fear, they were tears of victory. He had spoken. And the world had listened. Ethan stepped off the stage slowly, his legs felt weak, his palms were sweaty, but his heart was light. Lighter than it had been in years. As he walked toward his seat, people were still clapping. Some stood, others wiped their eyes. He had not used fancy words, no quotes, no statistics, no visual slides. Just 2 minutes of honesty. And yet, he had touched more hearts than any prepared script ever could. One of the judges, a respected speaker herself, stood and said softly, that was not a speech. That was truth. Her voice trembled slightly as she added, and truth always wins. In that moment, Ethan realized something profound. He had entered the competition to prove himself, but he left the stage having found himself. Later that evening, as the results were being announced, Ethan sat quietly, still unsure what to expect. He didn't care much about trophies anymore. What mattered was that for the first time, he had spoken without hiding. When they called his name as the winner, he couldn't believe it. The audience erupted again, but this time, it wasn't about who spoke best. It was about who spoke real. After the ceremony, a young woman approached him. Her eyes were red, her hands trembling slightly as she said, "Thank you. I was planning to give up today. But after hearing you, I won't." Ethan froze, feeling tears rise again. That moment hit him harder than any trophy or title ever could. He realized then that words can save lives. Not because they're perfect, but because they're true. He went home that night and wrote in his journal, "Sometimes, all it takes to change the world is 2 minutes of courage." The next day, clips of his speech began to spread online. Someone had recorded it on their phone and posted it with the caption, "The most powerful 2-minute speech you'll ever hear." Within hours, it was shared thousands of times. People from around the world commented, "I felt this. I needed this today. I thought I was alone." Ethan read those comments in disbelief. He was no longer just a shy young man who spoke once. He had become a voice for everyone who ever felt small or unseen. And yet, he knew one thing for sure. He hadn't done anything extraordinary. He had simply been honest. He realized that vulnerability is not weakness, it's the strongest bridge between one heart and another. When you dare to be real, you give others permission to do the same. The world doesn't need more perfect people. He would later say in an interview, it needs more authentic ones. Months passed, but the echo of that 2-minute speech continued to spread. Ethan was invited to schools, universities, and conferences to share his message about courage, mental health, and finding one's voice. He didn't memorize speeches anymore. He simply spoke from the heart. Because that was what had changed his life. He met people who told him that his 2 minutes had given them the strength to start over, to heal, to speak up, or simply to believe that their life still mattered. And each time he heard that, he smiled and whispered to himself, it was never about winning a contest, it was about winning connection. Ethan once said in an interview years later, "I used to think public speaking was about impressing people. Now I know, it's about impacting them." And when asked how he managed to move an entire room with such few words, he smiled and replied, "Because I stopped performing and started feeling." That's the lesson his story carries, that you don't need a microphone, a big stage, or the perfect words to inspire others. You just need to be real. When truth speaks, it doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to be heard. Years later, Ethan would sometimes stand before a mirror and smile. He wasn't practicing lines anymore, he wasn't rehearsing for perfection. He was simply remembering. Remembering the trembling young man who once believed his voice didn't matter. Remembering how, for 2 minutes, he had turned fear into fuel. He often visited schools, where he'd stand before young audiences and say, "You don't need to be fearless to speak up. You just need to be brave for 2 minutes." And that phrase became his signature. 2 minutes of courage. He would explain, that's all it takes to change your story. 2 minutes of saying what you really feel, of being your true self, of letting your heart speak before your fear does. You could see the spark in students' eyes when he said it. Because deep down, everyone had their own version of Ethan's silence. A dream they were too afraid to share, a truth they were too afraid to speak, a life they were too afraid to start. So if you're listening to this story right now, if you've ever felt invisible, uncertain, or unworthy, remember Ethan. Remember that courage isn't about not shaking, it's about shaking and speaking anyway. Maybe you're facing your own stage today. Not a physical one, but a moment that scares you. A job interview. A dream you've postponed. A truth you've been afraid to admit. Whatever it is, give yourself 2 minutes. 2 minutes to be real. 2 minutes to act, to speak, to start. Because sometimes, the smallest act of courage creates the biggest change. Ethan's life changed in 2 minutes. And yours can too. The story of the 2-minute speech isn't about public speaking. It's about finding your voice. The crowd didn't stand because Ethan was perfect, they stood because he was human. He showed that vulnerability isn't the opposite of strength. It's the source of it. He showed that one honest word can echo louder than 1,000 empty ones. And he showed that silence is not the end of the story, it's just the pause before courage begins. So whenever you feel afraid to speak up, to try, to start again, remember this: your voice matters. Your story matters. And 2 minutes of courage can change everything. The night of his first speech, Ethan walked home under the city lights, the applause still ringing in his ears. But what stayed with him most wasn't the noise of the crowd. It was the quiet inside his heart. For the first time, he wasn't afraid of being seen. He wasn't afraid of being himself. He looked up at the stars and whispered, "Maybe I was never voiceless, I just needed to listen to myself first." And in that moment, the boy who once stood frozen before a microphone became the man who inspired millions to speak, not through perfection, but through presence. Now, it's your turn. Your turn to face the silence, your turn to find your words, your turn to give the world your 2 minutes of truth. No one else can tell your story like you can. No one else can carry your message. And no one else can use their voice exactly like you. So today, don't wait for permission. Don't wait for the perfect time. Just start. Take that deep breath, step into your moment, and say what your heart has been waiting to say. Because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear you. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that your voice has power, don't keep it to yourself. Share this story with someone who needs courage today. Like the video to support more motivational stories. Subscribe to this channel, where we learn, aspire, master, reflect, and evolve together. Remember, sometimes all it takes is 2 minutes of courage to change a life, maybe even your own.